everyone, my name is Danae Davis and I'm here to interview Dr. Sherri Simmons Horton for her Wednesday Wisdom Talk called Activism versus Apathy. So let's get right into it. So, Dr. Sherri, what comes to mind when you think of this generation's form of activism?
Well, I mean, just in general, I consider activism to be a form of engagement, involvement, but I think that it's fueled by a passion that you have for something that you feel like needs to be, an injustice needs to be corrected, So I do think that activism is something that's changed, over the decades with regard to how this generation kind of maybe views and engages in activism a little bit differently than, say, the way I grew up, in earlier times. And so I do think that it means that you have to be involved, but it starts with the apathy part of the title of my talk has to do with is our generation currently apathetic to activism? Are they actually involved? Are they concerned? Do they have the passion to get involved in issues of injustice?
Okay. So, like you stated before, there is clearly a gap between our generations when it comes to forms of activism. How do you think we can bridge that gap?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that, every activist has to determine what their platform is.
Right.
And so if it's an act as, I don't want to say small, but I'll say as simple as, engaging in the right to vote, and it is a right to vote, but for, I believe, our race, African Americans, Black and Browns are concerned, I think that voting is something that's more should be considered a requirement and not necessarily a luxury so much, because there's so much that had to be done to get to that point. Just being able to vote became a form of activism for groups of the past. And so I do think that, first of all, there has to be determination of what's the platform. That could be the classroom, that could be the right to vote, it could be, in your communities, whatever it may be. But in terms of bridging the gap, I think that starts with somewhat of our generation really kind of understanding the platforms that you all are using these days, understanding the language that's used oftentimes in the current generation that's very different than the way we use language. In previous decades, activism, the platform for activism was primarily the church. Everything happened in the church. You worshiped at the church. You learned about current issues in the church. Policies and politics was dealt with in the church. Ministers were activists, that type of thing. So I think that we have to, my generation really has to kind of recognize the broader spectrum of the platforms. That's one thing. And then there's also, I think, in terms of the current generation being able to engage engage and bridge that gap, has to be an understanding of what happened. There's many in your generation may not even consider the idea that there couldn't have ever been a Black president. That's something that was a really far gone issue for us. How did we get there? So many in our generation think that, a lot of things that come to pass in terms of rights and things of that nature of injustice that we deal with now, it's often taken for granted. And to us, in my generation, it looks like y'all just don't care, or there's an apathy about, what has to be done on the ground to get things done. So I think that there's communication on both parts that need to bridge that gap, and then just really understanding each other's language and making a decision that really what we want to do is the same thing, but how are we going to get it done?
Prairie View A&M University is about the students. Students don't just come here for the education. They come for the faculty, for the creativity, the camaraderie, an excellent standard of living, and the school spirit. They come here to gain something profound and to give something back. Students come for the tradition of excellence. This is Prairie View A&M University. Our tradition, your opportunity.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Wednesday Wisdom Talk. I've had such a pleasure directing with Dr. Sherri Simmons Horton and, just learning so much about advocacy and apathy, and how we can change social change. Dr. Sherri Simmons Horton also teaches at PVAMU with criminal justice courses and social work courses, also teaching at Lone Star College in criminal justice courses, and as well as moving to UTSA and teaching at the College of Public Policy. So grab a pen and a paper because we are going to learn a whole lot today. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sherri Simmons Horton.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm here to give a presentation on advocacy or apathy. My goal today is to really just try to give information, inspire, educate, and hopefully send you guys out with some information that you can use as you go out into your work that you do. I consider this topic really relevant because of the social climate that we're in right now. We have a lot going on in our society that is very meaningful in terms of different issues that are going on in our communities, and I feel like this is a good time. I want to, during this talk, seek to kind of look at some comparisons between the way advocacy has been done and social change has been done in the past versus how it's being done now with our current generations that do their types of advocacy. My biggest thing is I want to challenge each individual and collective bodies to think about how they can raise their voices and be more effective in their advocacy and seeking out to do more social change. So I hope that you enjoy this. So I wanted to start first with a couple of quotes. It's always kind of good to start with a couple of quotes to kind of put things into some type of perspective. And the first one comes from Martin Luther King, where he says, "Our lives begin to end the day that we become silent about the things that matter." The next quote comes from Albert Einstein, and what he says is this. He says that the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them doing it but by those who watch them without doing anything. So we have to kind of think about that in some type of context. Are you going to be one of those persons who decides to do nothing, which is the apathy route, or are you going to be someone who decides to raise your voice and be an advocate? It's a very simple thing to do when you're thinking about wanting to do advocacy. The very first thing you have to think about is opening your mouth. Really, what I see oftentimes on campus is I see students walking around with their heads down, walking around with their heads in their phones. What is it that is your voice being captured on your phone, on social media? How are you raising your voice? What is it that you're doing to make a difference in the things that matter to you the most, in the things that you have a passion about? So one of the things that I think that's quite simple to know is that your voice is what starts the conversation about having any type of effect or beginning the process of social change. So let's take a look at some of the things that we can do to make those. First of all, I want to provide a couple of definitions. Apathy. So what apathy is, just to kind of give you an understanding, is it's really kind of a sense of I don't care. It's a state of indifference, a suppression of emotions, and it's also a suppression of you having no concern, no interest, or passion or motivation about anything. It says that nothing matters to you. I can't think of any type of situation or any of us that has something that doesn't matter to us. There's something that we're all passionate about. There's something that means something to every one of us. So apathy means pretty much is that you just don't have any feeling or concern about anything. That's not the climate that we're in. We're seeing a lot of people, a lot of organizations, a lot of groups, a lot of intersectional groups being affected in some way by something. But what is it that we're going to do about it? Is what we see on TV and on the news so far away from us that it doesn't have to matter to us? That's not the state that we would want to be in. The other side of apathy, or what I call the opposite of apathy, is what I consider to be advocacy. Advocacy has a whole different idea. It's action-oriented. It's going to mean that what it basically is defined as is an activity by an individual or group which aims to influence decisions within political, economic, and social systems and institutions. And so that right there says that this institution here at Prairie View A&M, if you see changes that need to occur, This is something, this is a platform by which you can start to do something. Usually when we're thinking of advocacy or making social changes, we're thinking that it's something really big, something that we can't accomplish, something that we can't do. When in essence, you know, you can start in just places that you are. This campus right here is a platform for which you can do that. Okay, so what is social change? Let's take a look at that. When you're thinking about what social change is, there first of all has to be something that needs to change. Is there an issue? Is there a problem? And how do we define what the problem is? How do we know that there's even a problem that exists? Well, first of all, there has to be a grievance, meaning that someone or something or someone has been bothered by an issue, a circumstance, and they have to say that I don't like this issue. I want something to be different about this issue, and so therein lies a grievance. So we start with the fact that there has to be a grievance, which starts in the first place. And it has that grievance has to be then recognized by an individual, and then a group, and then maybe even a community. But before slavery even ended, there had to be somebody that said that there's something about this that is just not right, okay? And so when we're thinking about how we start to impact change, we have to first identify what's the problem, what is the thing that we want to see different, okay? So it's a skillful assertion of a grievance, and it has to have certain objectives of things that you want to see different. The individual or group has to feel like they've been hurt or harmed. That's what entails having a grievance mean. So if you feel like you've been harmed by something, if you feel like you've been harmed by a group, a policy, a law, you've been pulled over by the police and you think you've been unfairly done so, well, the Constitution protects you in certain areas of that. And so it has to start with there being something that you feel like you've been harmed by or hurt by. And so when attempting to define the social welfare problem or the issue, then it means that it's important for you to ask yourself two questions. The first question is, what is this problem about? Who is this problem for? Is it a problem for me? Is it a problem for somebody else? And oftentimes what we're often seeing in some generations, whether they're past generations or current generations, and I say that it happens oftentimes nowadays in this generation, and I'll get to that in a little later. What we see is that if it's not hurting me, it's not my problem, okay? And we have to really kind of take a look at where these problems lie and who they're affecting, because if it just looks like it's something that's out there in cyberspace, it may be something that we think doesn't actually touch us. The second questions ask, who stands to win if I do something, and who stands to lose? Who's going to be affected by me making any type of change, okay? So what that's basically going to mean is that if it's not going to affect me, or am I going to get something out of it, then what am I going to do? One of the things that I really highlight or love about the advocacy and social change that happened during slavery and the 60s, and even many changes that go on right now, is the fact that the people who were thinking about doing the social change were thinking outside of themselves. They were thinking about what's going to happen long last after I'm not here. They were planting a seed for what's going to happen. It took 400 years for slavery to end. And many of us will believe, well, that was because Abraham Lincoln decided that slaves needed to be free. When in actuality what happened was for 400 years there were individuals engaging in civil disobedience so that they could one day realize that freedom, not necessarily for themselves, because some slaves stayed back so that others could be free. So those things were happening where people were making a decision that I'm going to plant the seed, or I'm going to do something so that someone else can tell the story and move that advocacy and effective social change along. That happened in the 60s. That's happened with the Parkland shootings. That's happened with the LGBTQ issues that are on the table. It happens all the time. So we're seeing that when there's social changes happen, advocates, true advocates, are not just thinking solely about whether or not this individually affects their own lives and their own circumstances. So what is the importance of social change? Why should it even matter to us? Well, I mean, I guess if we're happy with the way things are in every condition, if you're happy with the job that you have and the conditions that your children have and the conditions that your grandchildren have, if you're happy with the political framework that we're in and what it is that people and that the power groups are making decisions, if you're happy with that, then I guess there's not really a need of social change. But I would say the social change remains important. It remains very key in our lifestyles today. It remains very important in how it is that we make decisions about how we do anything. You know, who we put in office in any political circumstance makes the decisions on whether or not schools get funded, whether or not there's grants, whether or not there's loans, whether or not those things are present and resources are available, depend on who's in power. And we have to be willing to speak a lot of truth to power. That can be a very scary thing at times. Be very scary to speak truth to power because when you say something, you have to be ready to make the sacrifice. You have to be ready to make a decision that if this all blows up in my face, that I'm going to be okay with it. Think about all of the sexual abuse victims that we're seeing on television right now and what the backlash that they're getting as a result of deciding to raise their voice to something that means something to them. And they're still getting criticized. They're still getting ostracized by a lot in the community, but that's what it has to mean. It has to, the importance of social change has to come from a passion that means something from the inside out, that it's not just happening to you. It shouldn't even, a true advocate means that it doesn't have to even really necessarily happen to you. One of the reasons why I got into social services and have a very interest in social change and the social policy comes from very personal experiences. I have 6 children, 3 biological sons, 3 stepchildren, and all of them have what happens in their lives matters to me. I've had to advocate for a son who has special needs. I've had to advocate for my sons when they've had to deal with any types of racism on the streets. And coming into academia, I found a new platform because now that advocacy can spread out to students that I teach and in platforms like this. So you have to ask yourself, what's your platform? Where is it that you're going to be able to raise your voice? And traditionally, in historical context, what you see, or what we've seen in the past, is that those places have been places like the church. Those places have been places like in people's homes. We didn't have social media to rely on, you know, in the 60s and prior to that, maybe not even in the 70s. It wasn't until much later that we have that. But I would say that groups from the past and the present need to have a collective body and ask ourselves, is it the past groups that are apathetic or better advocates, or is it the current generations that are doing a better job of that? So that's something that I do want to look at. And so when I want to, when we come back, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I do want to spend some time talking about the current state of social change and what it is that we're doing now, and compare that to what was being done then. And let's kind of talk about which side is more effective, or if we're all doing the same great job. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Traditions are not made overnight. They are created through a legacy of excellence and a commitment to something much greater. For more than 135 years, Prairie View A&M University has provided students with a strong academic foundation, a unique college experience, and the opportunity to make their mark on the world. This is a place where friendships are formed, discoveries are made, and dreams are realized. This is Prairie View A&M University. Our tradition, your opportunity.
Right, because I think with our generation, it's more of, our generation is very insensitive to a lot of things. And a lot of cases, we are very sensitive to a lot of things. But as far as us showcasing it, you know, because we always use, you know, our social media platforms for things like this. So when we see things happen, it's like we don't act on it unless it's happening to us. Like, we'll act on it, like we'll retweet it, like, oh my gosh, this is an outrage. We'll retweet it, we'll look at it, and, you know, we'll share it, and, you know, we'll probably even form, you know, what both of our generations do really well, I think, as far as protesting and things of that nature. So I think with that, I think our generation, as far as activism and apathy, I think we are apathetic, but we don't know how to sympathize with it unless we're going, you know, unless it's happening to us.
Right, you know.
So, because especially when I went to the Smithsonian, in DC for the African American Museum, they have this little diner where you get to sit at.
Been there?
Yeah.
Been there.
Awesome. See it. Yes. But that diner where you sit there and you're wondering, and it asks you, okay, it basically asks you step by step, like, hey, will you do this or will you do that? So it's basically showing you, like, based off your ideas and your beliefs,
right.
if you're going to be on Martin Luther King's side or if you're going to be on Malcolm X's side. So I feel like our generation, we're thinking Malcolm X, and we want to be Malcolm X because, you know, we have a phrase that says, "Oh, I'm not my grandma," you know, and it's very disturbing to say that.
I agree with some of what you're saying. I do think that the current generation has an expectation of expediency,
right?
And if it can't be something that can be solved and dealt with like overnight,
right away.
it just is something that you know, we're just not concerned about. I think that also as a result of, you know, a lot of diversity in our, and a lot of, you know, integration in terms of the differences. There's a lot of different issues that are fought now that were not necessarily fought before. Back in previous generations, most issues were more with regard to racial issues, and there weren't, you know, so much until later, probably like in the maybe 70s and beyond, a push to deal with things like issues of LGBTQ issues, women's issues, because women's issues for Black women have primarily been kind of sauntered in with all race issues, you know. So we have a wider range of injustice issues to deal with, and you're right. I mean, I think that for a lot of the I will say challenges with the current generation is that, and then also this individuation, you know. But if it doesn't, you know, your passion for something is your currency, and if you have the expectation that you want to see something change, you have to be. The current generation has to get more comfortable with the idea that the change that you would like to see is going to take time. If it's going to involve policy change, you have to first of all have a grievance. You have to first of all have something that somebody is uncomfortable with before you can call it an issue. You know, everything is not necessarily an issue, you know, unless it is considered an issue by a wider audience. And so if you have that individuation, that goes in total conflict of, you know, the need to be a collective body, you know. So I do think that, you know, we have some things that we can do collectively still. I think that these days marching is one of the platforms, but there's also a lot of other effective platforms that can be used to get that word out, you know. Teaching, for example, I'm in a wide audience of new thinkers to be able to impact. That's a form of advocacy for me, is to be able to be in a classroom and teach, especially when I'm able to teach at an HBCU about issues of injustice, you know. So everything touches us, even if it's not slapping us in the face. And that individuation is something that has to begin to hopefully evolve and change over time.
Right. I believe that. So when and where does social change start for you?
Everywhere. I mean, you know, I always kind of take on this idea that charity starts at home. And I'm part of a blended family, but I have 3 biological sons, and they're all African American males. And so them being African American males in this climate, you know, that we're in today, I have to talk to them about, you know, how to deal with the police and how to deal with relationships. And so and it's scary sending them out in the door not knowing, you know, what they're ready for. But the activism starts with that. So if something is happening to them in the world where they haven't engaged with the police, which actually happened to one of my sons, then I have to be prepared to teach him through that particular experience, and then taking that to a larger audience. You know, whether I'm working with children and families in my career, or training foster adoptive parents, or working in the community. I think that being involved is the place. If there's a conversation that, say, you're having with colleagues and other students, and you have disagreement about something, the time to have that discussion is in those groups, and taking it to a wider audience. If someone is unhappy about parking on campus or something, the place to start is start local. I mean, I think that you start, when you are able to start in, say, smaller platforms, whether it's your family, your colleagues, involvement in organizations, you'll see change happen in those smaller groups faster, and it fuels that passion to go to bigger audiences to do something. But if you want to go right into saying, I want to change the criminal justice system right now, you have to know what you want to change about the criminal justice, because we can't do without police, we can't do without laws and courts. What is it that you want to see change? If you expect that change to happen in a fast space, it just doesn't operate that way. That's not the way politics works. That's not the way systems work. So I think that starting, where I start is charity starts at home. So I have 6 kids between my husband and I. It's just important to me to ensure that they're informed. That 4 of the children that I have are adults. And ensuring that they're registered to vote, ensuring that they exercise that. Because how am I having this conversation and I have children who may or may not vote? That just, that would be inconsistent. So I think that that's the place to start, but then also every platform that you're in, whether it's at a church or with, colleagues, groups that you're involved in. I mean, I'm involved in community organizations that span across the state. That's an opportunity to advocate. Every platform that you have to use your voice every opportunity that you have. So we're back. Thank you for coming back. Glad that you're here. I kind of just want to take a step back for a second and say, just kind of remind you where we were. I was kind of talking about what the importance of social change is, and why it is that we need to be a part of that. And I kind of started out talking about where my platform began, which was in my personal life, with my children, with my family, and advocating for them and finding my voice. One of the things that's really important as you think about how you will affect social change is to really have good information, okay? I was looking through social media this morning, and I was going through all of the different Facebook and Twitter PhDs, I like to call them, those who have their own personal information but are not basing their advocacy and the things that they share on actual facts and things that they know or read. So as scholars and as academics, what I encourage you to do is when you're thinking about how to affect social change is that you have more information so that you heighten the level of your objectivity, that you're able to also provide a backdrop for where it is your perspective is, and that you're not just coming from a place of sheer emotion. Sheer emotion can get you into a lot of trouble. And so I would encourage that if you're going to be an effective advocate, that you make sure that you get really some good information. Not just, it's important to get information from different sources, but that information should be as objective as possible when you're getting that. So to move on, the current state of social change with us. Is it working? Is it not working? What is it that we need to do better? What is it that we are already doing pretty well? Well, I want to kind of take the time in this part of the discussion to kind of take us back to what was working before. We didn't get to an opportunity to come to a college at Prairie View A&M University or at Hampton University or at Grambling State University. That wasn't always the reality for African Americans, as an example. I learned through my mentor that Prairie View A&M was the first, was here, opened up at the same time that Texas A&M opened, because there wasn't a place for African Americans to go to college. And actually even before that time, if you go even further back, there was a time that educating black people would get a white person into a lot of physical trouble. Their families would ostracize them. So even having the opportunity to read a book was something that was not allowed. clearly, as we look at the exponential numbers of scholars and academics that are African American now, we can say that somebody had to lay that groundwork for that to happen. So what is it that they did to make the changes so that even college could be a reality for us and for our children and grandchildren? So what was going on then, again, the platforms for that group of people had more to do with doing their advocacy within the church. You had black schools that black education that was taking place in the church. You had black education taking place in the home. You had people providing books undercover, you know, so we were always interested and very thirsty for knowledge. You know, it's just that we just didn't always have a platform and a place to necessarily do that. But those platforms were more informal and often hidden, but they were there. You know, there wasn't someone to get on a horse and take us to school. If money was a problem, people stayed, you know, a student that went to a school away from their family had other African American people to help them get through their college experience. And so we've always been supportive of one another in that role. But the platform were not these platforms that we see today. Moving forward into the 60s, the way that social change happened was through a lot of protest. You saw a lot of protests on the streets, you saw people getting arrested, you saw these types of things, but there were leaders who were willing, like Jesse Jackson, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, who were willing to walk the streets, and Rosa Parks, who was willing to just sit on a bus to be able to say, I should be able to do this. There was a grievance, there was a passion, there was a motivation for something to be different. And so as we move forward into what is our current generation, the platforms are even wider. They've gotten even more exponential. The older folks, as I like to call them, and I include myself in that group to some degree, we tend to think of social media maybe not so much as the platforms that we would prefer, you know, because we don't understand it the same way as the newer generations do. But those platforms in terms of social media are actually a really good platform for reaching a larger number of people in real time. The trouble is if you only rely on social media and the collective body of the older generation and the new generation doesn't come together to use each other's formats, that's when we start to get very divided. That's when the individuation begins to occur, where you've got just the younger generation more focused just on issues that just matter to them right there in the real time. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with being only concerned with what matters to you right now, but it is, you know, the collective body has to start with individuals in the first place. We do have to start to come together, but it does start with an individual situation. Don't try to touch those situations that are too big for you to kind of comprehend at this point. What you want to do is you want to affect social change where you see success in small bites, where you see that you can do a little and take smaller steps to where you gain more knowledge and information about processes and how systems work. That's what the focus needs to be. And when you look at our current leaders, as maybe some of the older generations may have some levels of even criticism for the newer generations, you do see people like D. Ray McKesson. You do see people like Tamika Mallory. You do see the students at the Parkland shootings who are starting to make a difference in the way that they do their social change by way of social media and some of the traditional methods. As a result of the Parkland shootings and all of the advocacy and protests that were going on, there's been several states that have started to change their gun laws just out of that. And so if the expectation is to just make social change very quickly, sometimes that can happen. But even if the social change takes a while, you have to be prepared to be able to go the distance. It's not something that can be done where you're wearing high heels and you want to walk slowly. You want to be able to, well, you do want to walk slowly, but you want to be able to take smaller steps. And you have to be able to run the distance and be prepared to run a marathon if you're going to do social change. It's not something that's going to always happen overnight. And those students who have been pushing for gun control laws through Parkland shootings issues and that type of thing have done so as a gradual pace. They don't have the support of all 50 states. They don't have the support of even the right and the left in politics in full scope. What they have is small bites and steps, and so far they've made differences in several states and changing some of the gun laws. You see people like Tamika Mallory, who is one of the heads of the women's movement and the Women's March. You see a lot of things starting to change with the Me Too movement. So things are starting to evolve over time. But these things were not things that just happened all of a sudden. They've been issues that have been on the table for a while. You see DeRay McKesson, who's the leader of Black Lives Matter. And as a result of that, we see more and more police being more accountable for their crimes. While it's not all police that are getting charged and that type of thing, we're starting to see that more happen. Black Lives Matter and the amount of people they were able to reach through social media and protests really had an effect on what we see now in terms of social change. So it's very important. So even though it may not affect you day to day, and you can drive in your car and you can feel safe that you're not going to get pulled over, if you do, now we have more police taping when they pull somebody over, they're taping that more. That could have been a result of all of the advocacy that's been going on. So we have to appreciate that. So you don't want to measure your effectiveness. Your effectiveness in your social change cannot be measured by the outcome that you anticipate. You have to measure your effectiveness on the effort that you put into your action. Okay, so it has to be, you can't look at, well, I didn't get what I wanted today. You have to look at, did I do something today? That's really the most important part, because somebody's going to be there in that relay picking up the baton next. Okay, and so in going forward, I wanted to kind of talk about the future of social change and who's got next. Well, I do want to say that with social media being a huge vehicle for which we drive social change and affect social change, I think that that's going to continue to be a platform that can be used. But how are you using that platform? You're going to be far less believable if your platform if your social media sites that you use are not sites that can draw the attention of leaders and political activists and that type of thing. If all you're drawing is people who speak to rhetoric and spew out a lot of vulgarity on television and that type of thing, that's what you're going to get back. You're not going to really affect social change. So I would encourage that if you use social media sites, that you're using them in a way that affects social change effectively. And effectiveness is going to be based on, how do I feel about what I did? How am I articulating myself? How am I showing myself to the full public? And is this problem something that is going to affect more than just me? That's how you're going to have some idea. I also think that as soon as you can touch someone in terms of our elementary school kids, you're seeing a lot more young people getting involved in climate change and these types of issues. And I'm talking about elementary age kids that are getting involved. The sooner we can inform young people, and when I say young people, again, I'm talking about those that are still in school, the better that we're going to have the opportunity to get them informed as they go through their lives. So it's and it's not just young people. I would still say that the responsibility holds to anybody. Nobody is, it's not going to, your issues or your grievances are not going to matter to anybody but you. And if you're willing, if you want to see the change happen, you have to be the person that has the voice to do so. So I want to close with one last quote that comes from the author Alice Walker. And she says, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking that they don't have any. If you lose your power every time you decide to lower your voice, to mute your voice, to say nothing. Start with being able to say something and having the courage to speak truth to that power and be prepared for whatever sacrifices that you have to make and whatever has to be done to make that, because it will matter later. And the future generations are listening to what it is that we're doing right now. I want to thank everybody for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions in the future. Take care. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you
I appreciate
so much. Dr. Sherri, it has been a pleasure working with you and also learning about not only social change, but things in, everyday life and how we can advocate by just, on our phones or, how to use social media, how to use our voice. Hopefully in the future, we can bridge that gap as far as our generations and generations under me and your generations and generations, over you. And we could just, meet up.
Let me just say, I think that we talked before, and we had a discussion which I really enjoyed because we're like two different generations, right? I think that it starts with having a discussion. Right. Having the courage to have a discussion and hear things that you don't want to hear, that you don't agree with. Yeah. And I say that not just to you, but as we were talking, listening to things that I didn't agree with. You know, how do I start to look at this generation differently? So I do think that having a conversation, even if that conversation is outside, having a conversation with friends or just understanding the point of view, because that's one thing I think that in my generation we don't always understand you guys' point of view. So
I think it's both, just stubbornness and I think my way is right and I'm gonna go by my way. I think we just have to, like we discussed before, just try to meet in the middle. And it does start with a conversation, but I think as far as conversations, everyone has to be open-minded. Right. That's the biggest point to even get any type of understanding.
Something. Absolutely, just saying something and being part of the process, understanding where it is you are and what it is. I mean, if you don't like the parking on campus, you have to be able to say something, but say it effectively without just complaining. You know, it has to be more than that. So it's about having information, having a discussion, being careful about, just viewing everybody's side of things without wanting to just be critical of it. So,
Right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for tuning in. We will actually, where can we get in contact with you if we have any more questions or any concerns, or do you have any public websites you would like to shout out?
I am on Facebook and Twitter under Sherri Simmons Horton. You should be able to find me with a picture. And I'm also here on campus at SIMMONSHORTON at student.pvamu.edu.
Awesome. So if you have any questions, any concerns, want to learn more about advocacy, want to learn more about the criminal justice system and how you can change, please don't hesitate to contact Dr. Sherri. And also, we will not have anything over spring break. Enjoy your spring break. Enjoy watching previous episodes. Go back and watch us again, But be sure to stay tuned for us next time after spring break as we share some more wisdom. Thank you so much.
Bye.